Welcome, welcome, welcome. What a crowd.
Hello, everyone. This is really great to see so many people interested in farming. My name's Jael, and I am an organizer with 350 Vermont. Last November, we launched a campaign called Put Carbon in the Ground campaign, and this campaign is geared all around regenerative ag and sequestering carbon. And so this webinar that we're offering tonight is part of that campaign, and we invited Kat Buxton from Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition to speak. Kat is an amazing person, very knowledgeable about soil health, an activist, a good friend of mine, and her resume is outstanding. She's done all sorts of things, including she's the co-founder for Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. She teaches composting workshops, and she's on the board of Rural Vermont. She's gonna go over, so I hope you all received the document that I sent with for you to enter questions, because there are so many people on tonight. We can't receive questions in the chat. But I just wanted to go over a few steps. You can go ahead and enter some questions into that document. I will be reading them to Kat later. And then we are going to be muting everyone because there are so many people on, sorry, that is my dog in the background squeaking his toy. I asked my kids to be quiet. I forgot to mention it to the dog. So if you have something that you, if you have a question that Kat hasn't answered after we've gone through all the questions in the document, people will be allowed to put a few questions in the chat. And if you want to find the chat, at the bottom of your screen, there's a lot of different icons, and you can just click on that chat icon. And then you can type in your message or your question. You can also see, if you hit on the participants list, you can see all the participants, everyone who's in the meeting tonight. And then underneath, if you hit on the participants icon, it has all the names, and then it has, under that list, there's some other buttons. And if you hit the more button, there's a thumb symbol, a thumbs up, a thumbs down, a hand clapping. But you can hit one of those icons if you want to get my attention. You can hit this thumbs up icon if you need to get my attention. So we're going to be keeping everyone muted, but if you have something you need to ask or something that's come up, you can enter that into the chat or put up a thumbs up and I'll call on you. But like I said, with this many participants, it's hard to let other people speak, and we want to give Kat as much time as we can to give her presentation. I guess that's it, and we'll get started. And I'll turn it over to Kat now.
All right, thanks, Jael. Hi, everybody. It's so good to see you all. I have to flip arrows to see all of you, so I'm waving to you all. Thanks for being here. Oh, look at all those hands. That's great. Thanks for being here, and I'm going to do my best to try and give you a short presentation so that we can spend a lot of time on Q&A. I think people are pretty eager to get their questions answered, and I'll do my best. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm much better in the soil than I am on a computer, so bear with me. But I'm actually getting pretty good at this Zoom thing. Been doing it a lot these days. Oh, that was the wrong one. Okay, hang on, let me try again. Okay. So yeah, my name is Kat Buxton. I live in Sharon, Vermont. My business is Grow More, Waste Less, food systems consulting. I work with schools and individuals all over the state, lead lots of presentations, and do a lot of community organizing work. And I love to grow food everywhere all the time. Hang on, I gotta fix it so that I can actually move my slides around. All right. So why isn't it work? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, we're gonna back up. Yep, Kat Buxton, we're gonna get started now. Grow food everywhere. Any of you who have seen any of my presentations before know that I like to talk about the soil health principles. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start off with that. When it comes to garden health, vegetable health, nutrient density in food, and ecosystem health, really understanding the principles of soil health are what we need to be able to inform what practices we are going to employ in each space. Every space is different. Vermont's different than Arizona, different than Africa, and northern Vermont's different from southern. The greens, west side of the greens are different than the east. The river valleys are different than the mountaintops. So the principles of soil health apply everywhere, no matter where you are on the planet. We're gonna be touching base on these principles throughout the presentation, and I hope that we get some questions on them when we get to the Q&A. So here I'll just mention that the top 4 are designed by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, used to be known as the Soil Conservation Service. And that's a branch of the USDA. It's really, they're great principles. They're very broad in scope, and we'll be going over those a little bit more. The 5th one was designed by one of my mentors, Gabe Brown, who's a North Dakota rancher. And integration of animals is important in every landscape. Nature never farms without animals. So in this case, we're talking about everything from really well-managed, holistic, managed animals, ruminants, cows, sheep, pigs, goats, whatever. We're also talking about soil biology, zebras and grass hoppers and elephants. So all of it, and humans. And number 6, I like to include in my presentations because water is life and water makes sense. And if you follow the top 5 principles, you will, you'll have been slowing and sinking and holding the water in place. When we feed the soil, what we're really doing is maximizing photosynthesis. So growing plants and growing biomass in soil above the ground and below the ground in the form of living plants that we eat, that we use for medicine, that all sorts of other beings on the planet need. Everything below the ground like microbes and roots and worms and macroorganisms, microorganisms, all are fed by the sun. So really, when we're growing anything, we're maximizing sunlight. And that's an important understanding when trying to figure out, how do I grow a healthy ecosystem in this environment? The question that you might ask is, how do I maximize sunlight in this environment? How do I maximize photosynthesis in this environment? You can't necessarily change the amount of sun, but you can change the amount of photosynthesis by having green growing plants. And when you do that, all of those plants, all of that life above the ground and below the ground, bugs, microbes, etc., that is biomass, and that is made of carbon. So when we think about drawing down carbon, what we're doing is inviting life to thrive. And that is carbon. That would have been carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The term sequestering carbon is a tricky one. A lot of people, I think, get confused that when we take it out of the air, we put it in the ground and there it stays forever. And that's just not the case. Carbon is a cycle. So if we can restore the means of photosynthesis, we are restoring the carbon cycle. Plants convert sunlight to energy. That's photosynthesis. And about 50% of the energy that plants take in, all leaf surfaces, doesn't matter if it's big or small, if it's on the ground or up in a tree, about 50% of that carbohydrate energy is invested into the root system as sugars. One of my teachers, Dr. Elaine Ingham, who I highly recommend, you can Google her and she's on YouTube as well. She likes to call those exudates the cakes and cookies. So the sunlight basically takes CO2, turns it into cakes and cookies that plants then feed to microbes. And those microbes are very specific about the kinds of sweets they like. So different kinds of microbes are going to be attracted to different kinds of plants. And that's soil health. That's how nutrients get cycled. That's how forests eat. It's not about bags of fertilizer. It's about maximizing photosynthesis, maximizing diversity, and also numbers of organisms above and below the ground. This picture on the right side is a pretty famous one online, and I'm sorry I don't have the source for it. I got it from the Soil for Climate page, which is a great organization. If you don't know about Soil for Climate, they're on Facebook and they've got over 10,000 members from around the world. Lots of really great information and research on that page. So what we're looking at here is Midwestern soil. We're not as blessed as the Midwest to have this much loose topsoil. In Vermont, we generally hit bedrock before we get to that point. But no matter how deep your topsoil is, that is how deep your roots can go. And when they hit bedrock, they'll bend once they hit that bedrock. The slide on the left side of the screen is showing the place around a root here that we call a rhizosphere, and that's indicated by the blue area. That rhizosphere is, I like to call it a magical place, but it's a scientific, like it's an actual place where all of the life is getting the sugars from the plants. So that rhizosphere is a stimulating point that we want to try and nurture by maximizing photosynthesis, maximizing the types and kinds of plants and living roots in the ground year-round for as long as possible. In our climate, that probably means a little more conifer than annuals. It's not that I don't want to grow lettuce and carrots, I grow them every year, but I'm also trying to transition things more toward perennials and more toward evergreen plants that can continue to photosynthesize. The root hairs, in addition to providing that rhizosphere, that place around plant roots where microbes thrive, billions and billions and billions of those organisms, bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, micro and macro arthropods, and miles of fungal hyphal hair, which are like the tiny little filaments that come out from fungus. You have to use a microscope to be able to see them. And all along those root hairs, in addition, in soil are pore spaces. About 50% of soil, healthy soil, is made, or a soil aggregate, is made up of pore space, and that's air. It's a place for air and water to move through. All life, all those billions of organisms need air and water as much as you and I do. This picture is from the Conservation Research Institute. This is showing southwestern prairie plants. And so again, we don't have 15 feet of topsoil in most places in Vermont, but if we did, the root systems of these plants could go that deep. And the gardeners on the screen, and I almost said in the room, will see that there, you know, some of these are echinacea and lupin. There are other plants that we recognize here. So these are not, it's not that they're not relevant to Vermont. I just want to point out that this is not a Vermont picture. What I do like to point out here is on the top left corner, the little red circle is showing you your standard lawn grass. And when we think about maximizing photosynthesis with living roots in the ground, with lots of living roots that are surrounded by a rhizosphere that are full of billions and billions and billions of organisms, getting those cakes and cookies made by the plants for the sun, sequestering carbon, cycling nutrients, we want to see a lot more roots than our lawn generally provides us. So we'll talk a little bit about lawns later as well. I think an important part of the equation of understanding how to create a healthy ecosystem, including in your garden, is understanding at what stage is that land in its ecological succession. This is really important because the biology underneath the ground co-evolves with the plants in an ecosystem above the ground. So if you're trying to grow a vegetable garden, which is a disturbed area by and large, you want to have a highly bacterial population of organisms in the soil. You want to have a lot of organisms in the soil, not just 3 or 4 kinds, but lots of different kinds of bacteria in the soil. And most vegetables really like a lot of bacteria. So that's why we generally till our gardens, plus it's just a belief system we're locked into. We'll talk more about that too. If you're trying to grow a garden in a place that was recently a forest, you're going to have a hard time because the biology in that soil evolved with a forest, and you have a highly fungal dominant system. You have a high fungal ratio and a high bacterial ratio. It's excellent for lots of kinds of plants that like to grow in forest ecosystems, but it's not so good for broccoli and tomatoes. So understanding where in ecological succession is your land and how can you adjust your gardening plans based on that. I don't like to read my slides, so I'm going to assume that you're reading the bits underneath showing you that what we're looking at are 5 basic stages of ecosystem function. And on the left side is the side that was most recently disturbed. That could have been a flood, a volcano, an earthquake, or a rototiller. And in all of those cases, we're going to end up with bare soil where nature is going to send in her first responders to cover that soil. Another one of those soil health principles, keep soil covered with living roots whenever possible and green growing plants on top of them. And that's exactly what nature does. We call those plants weeds. All the way on the right side, you're looking at the climax forests, and everything in between is sort of listed there. And just in case you're wondering, all of my slides are going to be available in the email that follows up this event, plus this event is being recorded. So I'm happy for people to use my slides to get the word out there. So when we think about our lawns, I love lawns. You know, I think it's great to walk in them in bare feet, roll around in them, you know, and then check for ticks afterwards. Lawns are great. But do we need to have so many of them? Can we rethink the way we use them? Can we think about the spaces where we like to walk in grassy paths and we like to play badminton or other lawn games and we like to roll around or whatever? And can we shift those other places not to be lawns so that we can deepen those root systems? Again, I'm not going to read my slides, but it suffices to say here that we have more lawn in acres of cropland than we do many other commodity crops in our country. And we like to blame farmers for what they do or don't grow. Generally, they do or don't grow what they grow or don't grow because we've asked them to grow it or not grow it. We are the ones that grow the lawns, and we have the power to actually change the amount of photosynthesis, the amount of biology living above and below that ground, the amount of biomass, the amount of water infiltration, and the amount of food available, not just for humans, but for all the other beings that we share this beautiful planet with. So here's another look at those soil health principles. You can find these up on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website at any time. You can also find various portions of these in various other soil health advocacy sites on the internet. This is an example of a diverse diversified lawn. This is actually my lawn. And you're looking at violets and clover and rye and fescue and dandelions, a couple different kinds of violets in there. There's also some sorrel down there. Occasionally bulbs come up through it. There's plantain. It's always green. I tend to let it grow for quite a while, especially in spring, so I can harvest my violet blossoms and my spring violet leaves, which are really delicious and nutritious. So when you have a diversified lawn during drought times, you're going to retain more water in your soil. You're going to have flowers throughout the growing season, not just at one time of year. And most lawn grass doesn't flower, but we have lots of insects that rely on those flowers, not just pollinators, but lots of beneficial insects that are relying on those flowers. And the root systems, you might imagine if you're a gardener and you've pulled up probably most of these plants in these pictures, you have pulled up as weeds in your garden. And so you know what their root system looks like. And they're a little more compatible. They can work together under the ground in a way that grass can't. They can go a bit deeper. Clover is a wonderful thing to have in your lawn. I have a picture coming up soon. I'll be able to show you. Oh, there it is. This is a clover root. And those little white balls that you're seeing here are actually nitrogen nodules. So clover is a legume, which means it's part of the pea and bean family. And everyone in that family, that's all the clovers, vetches, peas, beans that we eat, lupin, lots of different trees are all kinds of legume plants, and they are able to fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere with the help of a special bacteria that lives in the soil. When you have clover in your lawn, natural nitrogen fertilizer that is cycling through the plants in your ecosystem, assuming that you have all of the right biology there. It's not just one. It's never just one. It's never a silver bullet. It's a systemic, a whole system's function that we're trying to create conditions for. So leguminous plants like clover in your lawn can be really helpful. That long, deep root system also helps to break up compaction and bring up nutrients and water to the surrounding plants during times of drought. So healthy soil is the key to holding landscapes and communities in place. I could go on and on and on about soil facts, but I'm not going to. I'm providing a lot of resources along with this presentation that you'll be able to follow up afterwards. And again, you can look at these slides. But a couple things I just want to point out from this one is that soil organic matter, which is SOM on these slides, stands for soil organic matter, and that is everything that is not soil that's in your soil. So it's all the dead bugs and plants and the decaying ones and the ones that are not quite dead yet, and root systems, and that is all organic matter. And organic matter added to your soil helps to turn your soil into a sponge, along with living biology, including bacteria, nematodes, protozoa, microarthropods, and fungus. So having soil organic matter in your soil is important because it's food for those organisms, and it's also helping to create the sponge that's going to be able to hold a huge amount of its weight in water. 18 to 20 times its weight in water can be held per acre in, I think it's 1% of organic matter added to your soil. Yes, that's what it says at the bottom there. The other thing I want to point out is that 1 teaspoon of soil, and it could be 1 tablespoon, I might have that wrong, contains over 1 billion organisms. Bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, miles of fungal filaments. We're talking about billions of different kinds of organisms, not just in numbers. I'm going to go through a few slides now that I like to call minimal disturbance gardening. So these are from my gardens. Over the past couple of years, I'm always experimenting in small and large patches kind of everywhere that I grow food. So these are tomatoes that grew through the whole growing season of 2018 with this living understory underneath it. I didn't weed my tomatoes. I went in and cut instead of dig out roots, with a few exceptions, like if something was growing right up against the root of my tomato plant, I might pull that one out. So in September 2018, I was still harvesting from these tomatoes. I had gotten the most amazing tomato harvest that year, although it was a really good year for tomatoes all around. And in September, I sowed in oats, peas, and buckwheats. So what I did on the left here, that's what it looked like beforehand. I went in with scissors and I cut everything on the ground except the tomato plants because I wanted to keep eating that fruit. And then I scattered oats, peas, and buckwheat, and I poked the seeds into the ground a little bit, and I walked away. And that winter, I had oat, peas, and buckwheat covering the ground. And in the spring, all of those crops die over winter. So all I had was a little bit of biomass dried up at the bottom. Now, one thing I do want to point out, I did that in September. If I had done that in July, I would have gotten a lot more biomass. So it would have been a much more effective understory cover crop, but I did get some biomass, and some of that continued to grow the next year, the oats, peas, and buckwheats. So at the top, you're looking at the cut tomato patch underneath the tomatoes. The middle, you're looking at those 3 seeds, oats, peas, those are field peas, and buckwheat. And on the bottom, you're looking at the seed scattered on the ground after I just had cut it back. A lot of what I cut, I let drop, just drop right in place. Sometimes I'll scatter seed and then let it drop. And if it's a lot, like if it was 3 feet tall when I cut it, I might cart that away and put it in my compost pile. This is that same tomato plot in November. So you can see the oats are coming up here. All the little bits of grass are the oats coming up. If I were to zoom in, you'd see a few peas and some buckwheat too. There wasn't a whole lot of germination, but again, if I had done that a little earlier, which I've done since then, I would have gotten greater germination. In 2018, I grew my peppers in this same way in a slightly different patch just across the way. So there are a couple of pepper plants here, and they're actually loaded with peppers. And then you can see those same tomatoes growing in the middle of the season when they were flourishing with fruit. This is what my garden looked like all summer long. Every once in a while, I'd go in there with scissors and I'd cut it back, and that's it. There was very little, if any, weeding. This is an example of the plants that were growing underneath. So I have been cultivating what I call a polyculture. A polyculture is any number of plants, usually more than 5, that play well together, that can coexist with one another without any one overrunning the other ones. What you're looking at here, I basically have a polyculture in my yard that sometimes some of the plants are more prominent than the other. There are about 6 or 7 plants depending on the variety, and I listed that on my last slide. I'll go over those again, but you can see some of them here. We're looking at white clover, wood sorrel, wild strawberries, buckwheat, Johnny jump ups. I have some dead nettle or lamium, which is actually a perennial, but it's a low growing perennial ground cover, and it's really easy to cut back and just tell it, you know, you can't grow there right now. So these all cover the ground. Imagine yourself as a raindrop slamming down on this ground in the middle of a hard rain in the summertime. If it were bare soil, it would splash up, it would wreck the ground, your vegetables and plants would be dirty. In this soil, that raindrop is intercepted by lots of different leaves. It slows down, it trickles and goes into the ground and slowly infiltrates into the sponge. And when the sun comes out, that soil does not evaporate because it's covered with green growing plants that are also photosynthesizing the entire time, feeding those cakes and cookies to the microbes under the ground. Now, it seems counterintuitive. We want to say, oh, they're stealing nutrients, but let's just look at the forest. Let's look at the natural ecosystems all around us that are thriving with biodiversity stacked all on top of each other. They're cooperating. They are not competing. So this is that same plot that we were just looking at in the spring of last year after the peppers. So I just left the peppers in the ground. I cut everything down and just let it drop on the ground. And this is what you're looking at. And this very next year, I planted tomatoes in this spot. And that's a big no-no, right? Because they're both nightshades. You're not supposed to plant them in the same spot. Well, the tomatoes I grew the next year were amazing because when you have the right biology in the ground, your diseases and pests can't take hold. They're just outnumbered. So here's another example for you, and this is a raised bed. So I have 2 raised beds outside my house that I have a glass door on top of, where I just like to try and use it for season extension. And I'm going to take you through 8 steps of cutting that bed up. So on the left side here, we're looking at April 2018. This is what it looked like when I opened up the glass in the spring. And you might think, oh, wow, that's really weedy. And I thought, wow, those dandelion greens look amazing. So that was my dinner for that night. So the first thing I did is I harvested food from this garden. Then, oh, wrong slide. What happened? Okay. Then the second thing I did was I harvested plants from this garden. On the left side, we're looking at really tight clusters of lots and lots of baby Johnny jump ups and baby forget-me-nots, the annual version of forget-me-nots. And so I potted all those up and I planted a lot of those in the understory of the blueberries at our school garden. And I also gave a lot away to friends and family members that are always looking to have more low-growing, non-competitive living ground covers in their gardens. So that's something you can do as well. And when we think about regenerative gardening, it's not just what we're growing for our food, it's how we're using the space and how we're thinking about our relationship with those plants. So then once I've harvested everything I'm going to eat and I've dug up all the babies that I'm going to pot up and give away or put somewhere else in my garden, then I come in and just seriously hack the ground. So on the right side, that's the finished product. Everything's cut down. A lot of it was just dropped right in sight. Some of it went into a bucket in front of the bin that I might have a picture showing you that, but it wasn't much. It was just some of the debris I took away. And just in case you're not sure, like, where do I cut? Here's a little video for you. And you just grab and cut. That's it. Grab and cut. And then pull out those dandelion leaves and eat them, and pull out those Johnny jump up blossoms and eat them, and any of the other plants that you can use for food or medicine or dye. Take those and eat those too. Then, in that very same ground, you're just going to cut with your little ground fork. You're going to make some furrows, and there's my ground fork up there on the top slide. You're just going to dig in, and you're going to move the soil to the left and to the right and make a little bit of a furrow there. And then you're going to put some seeds in and put your mulch on top. And this is what I like to do for very small seeded things like lettuces or carrots. If it were peas or a baby plant, you wouldn't have to break the ground at all, really, other than to put the plant in the ground. But because they're little seeds, I like to make a furrow, and then I like to cover that furrow with potting soil or something so that I can make sure to see when those seedlings are coming up. And you can see them on the bottom here. Those are little brassica seedlings that came up about 10 days later. So to get a closer look at what those furrows look like, that's all I did. And this green patch in the middle, it's holding one kale that overwintered in my garden, and that actually fed us for months that year. It kept growing. And then underneath it, I leave the strips of the polyculture, AKA weeds that were growing in there, because those are going to continue to photosynthesize and feed the biology underground and hold water in place and get that sponge and nutrient cycling happening in my raised bed. Just a little bit of mulch on top of those furrows is all of you need. And I like to use often just the debris that I cut from the garden for that mulch. You don't need to have anything fancy. I typically use a mixture of dried grass, straw, hay, and dried weeds. And so here you can see a couple of weeks later, those greens are growing a little bit taller. A week or so after that, I would just go in with scissors and cut my harvest and let it grow 2 or 3 times and then I would get more seeds growing on the side of it. And all along, I'm eating the Johnny jump up flowers and the dandelion greens. So another example of garlic, and you can call this no-till garlic. I really prefer to call it minimal disturbance. I think when we say no-till, people get scared about putting anything in the ground, and you know, it's okay, but do we have to till the whole thing? And maybe we do, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A as well. Maybe you're talking about larger areas, so be sure to ask me those questions. On the left side here, we're looking at where I was going to plant my garlic in October 2018. And that is a pretty thick bed of wild strawberries and white clover. Some of that lamium, the dead nettle plant that I was telling you about, the perennial that I like to grow that's low growing, the bees love it. And so what I did is I just kind of like raked off most of the debris off the top to expose some of the soil. I thinned some areas. There was one giant mullein plant in there, mullein weed. I took that out because it was too big, and I took that out by the root. In the middle, you're getting to see what the ground actually looked like up close. I put my dibble in the ground, which is just like a broomstick, to make a hole to put the garlic clove in. I put my garlic clove in, I covered it up, and then I put mulch on it. I use straw, hay, and leaves because that's what I have access to. That big green field there is actually a hay field, so I often use hay from that field because it contains all the weed seeds my garden already has. And then the next spring, there's the garlic coming up without any issue at all with the strawberries and everybody else around it. When we leave weeds, we get more flowers than we've ever seen, and we get the native flowers that actually attract and keep the native insects. So not just our pollinators, but the insects that need those plants to breed on or to eat. And a lot of those native insects, those beneficial insects, are eating a lot of the pest insects in our gardens. There are, 900,000 insects or something like that in the world, and we need them all. About, a tiny fraction of 1% of those are actually agricultural pests. So having diverse gardens with lots of different plants of different shapes and sizes and different bloom times, different everything different, as much different as you can, just like nature shows us how to do. Diversity begets diversity. This is a red clover. It's Vermont's state flower. It's a beautiful flower. It's medicine. It's food. It can be a real beast in the garden with the way it grows. So I just keep cutting it back, which gives me lots and lots of red clover blossoms to add to my salads. And so I'm going to leave the slideshow there. I have a lot more slides that I can bring up if we feel like that's necessary in the Q&A, but I would like to turn it over and get a lot of questions answered. So I'm gonna let Jael lead that.
All right. So I hope you all were able to, I'm actually going to give everyone like a minute to add a question if they weren't able to. In the document, I shared the link. I can share it again if need be. It's just easier because in the chat, I miss a lot of the questions.
And I just want to encourage you all that there are no bad questions ever. Someone else always learns from your question. So please ask whatever you're feeling. I want to support you in feeling confident and comfortable to go out and grow your gardens with as little disturbance and as much confidence as possible.
So I shared the doc. I'll give everyone a couple more seconds to go in and add questions. Looks like a lot of you are in there already. So I try to separate them by topic. For those of you who are just coming in now to ask questions, you can go ahead and add them at the bottom of the question list. That's probably the best way to do it for now, because I think I'll start up at the top. So Preparing garden beds. Preparing 80 by 20 garden beds from hayfield, how to break the sod and generally prepare. Have tractor, plow, and harrow. Bad back, hip, what's a good crops for good yield for clay and former hayfield.
Okay, so that's a big question. There's a lot of
Big
questions
question.
within that question. I would say the first thing to be is patient, because it's going to take a little while to turn a hayfield into something that can yield the vegetables the way you want them to be yielded. So sometimes your initial yields might be low in the first year, so just keep that in mind. If you have a bad back, that becomes a priority. So you need to keep yourself in the picture. You know, when we think about permaculture and we think about regeneration and we think about just living in harmony with the planet, that also means that we need to actually be well too. So don't hurt yourself. If you're going to use a tiller in 80 by 80 area, that might be the quickest way to do it. But when you do that, you will be seriously disturbing all of the soil organisms in that area. So that means that you just need to build them back up and nurture them, which means that you're going to want to follow the soil health principles and get living roots in the ground with as many diverse species as possible. So possibly a mixed cover crop if you're not looking to produce food in the first year. Maybe you do 4-foot rows of mixed diverse cover crop and then 4-foot rows of vegetables, so that you can do a little bit of both in that first year. So that's if you're tilling. If you're tilling, just till that organic matter right into the field. The time of year that you till matters because you're adding seed. But also when you till into an old field, you are unearthing dozens of years worth of seed stock and bringing it right to the surface so that it is now in its bare ecosystem environment with all its seeds exposed. And what nature will do is cover that up with all of those weed seeds sprouting as soon as possible. So incorporating some kind of mulch into that system might be helpful. I think that's the best I can do with a short answer. I would invite you, I mean, I'm crazy busy, but I would invite you to send me an email, and I could possibly give you a little bit longer in-depth answer and invite you to check out some resources. In terms of what crops to grow, I heard that you say you have clay soil, and while that can be really challenging, the good news is that clay soil has all the nutrients that you need. What it's missing is the pore space for the biology to live. So creating the conditions for organic matter and water to get down into the soil to create the space for those organisms to live is the challenge. It doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. So clay soil is not something to be totally bummed about. I know it can be a challenge to grow in, but you really do have incredible nutrient exchange capacity with clay soil. So I hope that was helpful.
Okay, so the next one is, how can a garden bed be prepared for immediate use without tilling if there are plants like goldenrod, Virginia creeper, and other things with persistent root systems?
Okay, so that is similar to the last question, but
yeah,
but I will say, you know, yeah, tilling is in some ways going to make that a lot easier, but it's also going to break all of those rhizomaceous plants up into millions of pieces, and each one of those will grow. So what I mean by rhizomaceous is that some plants scatter by broken roots. So when you go through with a tiller and break them up, you've just basically asked that plant to grow 6 times faster next time. So something you could do, depending on what size you're looking at, let's just say you want to plant a tree. Let's just say you want to plant a tree in that field with goldenrod and Virginia creeper and other plants there. What I would do is spend a good deal of time siting that tree to find out where is going to be the best spot for that tree, and for me and all the other creatures that share that land, for that tree and for the tree's life, thinking 25 or longer years. And then I would dig a hole big enough for the tree right through the ground cover. And then I would, I think I would pile on some compost. That might not be trees actually don't always like compost the first year, so maybe this isn't the best. Let's say I'm planting a currant bush. Okay, so I'm gonna dig a hole for the currant bush, and I'm gonna layer all around that hole with lots of compost, and I'm gonna cover those plants up. And then I'm gonna plant my currant bush in that hole. And then I'm gonna take cardboard and I'm going to put a collar around that currant bush, not so close that it gets slugs and all sorts of other things up against the base of the plant, but I'm going to bring it out 5 or 6 feet all the way around that currant bush to block photosynthesis so that the plants around it can't grow. Meanwhile, the plants underneath the ground are some of them are going to start decaying because they're not getting photosynthesis, and that decay is going to feed my currant bush. And some of those, like Virginia creeper, are just going to send their roots out to the very edge of the cardboard and grow like mad. That's what they're going to do. But that 5-foot area around your currant bush will probably be pretty good. And you can actually plant lots of plants into that. If you want to plant through the cardboard, you poke a hole in the cardboard, you put your plant in there. Most of us don't like to look at cardboard, but it is a nice top layer. So you can put leaves or straw or something else on top of that that's nicer to look at. But the cardboard is doing a really good job at blocking the sunlight and allowing for moisture to pass through eventually because it's porous. So that's different than doing black plastic or something where you're actually suffocating the plant and the microbes underneath the soil. There are some cases where black plastic might be a good thing, so I'm not totally dissing that, but I think I'll leave that there. Did I answer that well, Jael? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So we're going to skip to around the different sections just to give a chance to touch on some other topics. So cover cropping. Have you tried living mulches, tomatoes or peppers underplanted with clovers, oats, buckwheat, etc.?
Yeah. So that was actually featured a bit in my show. I like peas, oats, and buckwheat in our climate. I think it's such a brilliant mix. It's only 3 plants. I'm experimenting with other species that I can throw in there. Sometimes I throw in mustards or greens, from some of my old seed packets, although these days I'm beginning to hold on to those old seed packets because seeds are getting scarce. But brassicas, can be great as well. Lots, any herbaceous plants. The thing I like about those is that when you plant them while the soil temperatures are warm enough, and that's 50 degrees or above, and if you're not sure about that, you can use your finger. You can actually just stick a thermometer in the soil and see what the soil temperature is. Seeds need a certain soil temperature to sprout. So those are all summer crops: peas, oats, buckwheat. A lot of those that we like to use as our summer crops. If you can sow them in early, they will grow right up until the frost, and then they will die. They will turn brown, they will flatten underneath the snow, and in the springtime, you will have a flattened, dried out plant matter on top of your soil that's directly ready to plant in. It's beautiful. The same is not true of rye. So we hear about rye a lot, and rye can be a really incredible cover crop and companion plant in a lot of cases. And if you're working with a lot of land and you're using livestock, or you have tillers and tractors, rye can be great. But if you're just using your back and a spade fork, rye is a beast in the garden. It will grow back year after year after year if you're getting perennial rye. So just make sure you know what you're getting when you buy it. I'd like to make a recommendation for a really great seed company called Green Cover Seed, and they're ramping up their sales now. They are as far as I know, the best and most accessible, diversified cover cropping seed company in the country. They work with a lot of growers, and these days they probably are, I wouldn't be surprised to find that they're scaling only to growers and selling only to growers right now because of a bit of a seed shortage. But be thinking about that. And as you read about cover crops, think about what is good in our region, be creative, look to nature. What does nature automatically put as cover crops in your garden? And are you pulling it out? So when I showed you my polyculture underneath my tomatoes and peppers, those were the plants that just grew in my garden, partly because I've cultivated those over the year. I like dead nettles. The wild strawberries are kind of everywhere. The sorrel constantly grows. I used to pull it out painstakingly, and now I leave it and it attracts bugs, and I get little heart-shaped candies for my salad. It's amazing. I hope that was helpful with cover crop seeds. And stay tuned. I don't know how many of you folks are on Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. We have an email listserv where lots of really great conversations happen. And you can often find really good answers like, what seed should I use, from people all over the state who are using them, have made mistakes, have had successes. So it's a great place for all kinds of questions and discussions. And you don't have to be from Vermont to be part of our coalition. It's free to join. Just go to our website and take the survey.
All right. Composting. I am in receipt of approximately 6 to 8 month old horse manure that we scooped off a field. The field from which he got his hay never was sprayed with persistent herbicides. The manure is still in a small baseball size. What are the next steps to ensure composted horse manure?
It sounds like those little baseballs need some air. And so it kind of depends what you're growing. If you plan to grow lettuce where you're planning to put that horse manure, then I would definitely want to process that horse manure. And what I mean by that is create the conditions for billions of organisms to process it for you in a compost pile. So horse manure is typically a very high carbon material because horses eat carbon materials. They eat grass and they poop grass. And the nitrogen was, part of the food that they ate, and it gave them their nutrients. So what's left is high carbon material. We still call it a nitrogen sometimes when we're composting, so it can be a little confusing. I apologize if that statement is confusing to anybody. If you are planting fruit trees, use that horse poop right now, not a problem. If you're planting potatoes, you might want to break it down a little bit. There are some guidelines about how finished compost needs to be before you use it for different kinds of crops. If we think about what nature does, animals poop next to plants all the time. And it turns out fine. But we also have some health considerations, and generally an animal's not pooping a huge pile of horse poop all at one time. So I want to encourage us to look to nature for answers like this. Like, when you see that big pile of poop on top of the ground, it's not decomposed. Why isn't a plant growing out of it? Well, maybe it's because it's too hot and seeds couldn't actually sprout from it. So if your compost is not finished, when you turn it, it will heat up, and that could cook your seeds. So definitely use that horse poop. It's really great stuff. Mix it with other materials if you can. If I had a magic wand and could give you all the ingredients you need, I would say take that horse poop and mix it, say a third with some nice fine wood shavings, not sawdust, but wood shavings, and then add in some leaves, last year's leaves, or you could wait till your comfrey grows up and throw those leaves in, or dandelion leaves, although you should eat those, and then cook that for a couple of months. Make sure there's air and moisture in there like a wrung out sponge. That pile will heat right up, and in a few months you will be psyched.
All right. Thanks, Kat. Soil health. Okay, lots of questions here. As I say hello to my yard and gardens, I'm not sure what to leave alone and what to rake up and clean up. I'm used to raking grass so it grows better, and also is not matted down and thatchy, encouraging grubs to eat it, and then moles to wreck my lawn by burrowing to get at the grubs. For best soil health, should I not disturb the thatch grub mole cycle? Are grubs really my friends?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot there too. Okay, so dethatching a lawn can be a good thing because of compaction. So oftentimes what happens with lawns, whether because we walk on them or we drive on them, or because they're often built on really poor, building lot soil, they can be really compacted. There isn't a lot of air or water room for pore space in the ground. So you can aerate a lawn by using, there are big machines, you see them on college campuses all the time. It's like a barrel with spikes on it that aerates big lawns, and that's to get air into the lawn. And then you can sprinkle down, some people use fertilizer, but you could also sprinkle down compost or some biostimulants, make your own compost tea or worm casting tea or something like that to get the biology into the ground along with some air and water. Dethatching can be a really helpful tool for the same reason, that you're lifting the top and allowing for air to get in there to help with decomposition, to help feed plants, to help feed microbes. You can thatch and lift and leave it, or you can thatch and pull it away and compost it. Much of that is up to you, how aesthetic you are about that sort of thing. I'd like to encourage us all to think a little more wildly about our ecosystems, because when we create like monoculture lawns or big lawns, even if they're diverse, we're really not inviting any other beings to share that with us. It's really, we need to rethink the way that we share our land with all the other beings on this planet, because it's their land too. So dethatching can be a good, useful tool. If it's a lot of thatch on top, like say it's underneath a giant oak tree and you didn't rake last year, take those leaves up and bring them off to a compost pile, and then add that material back into somewhere else where you're growing something. If it's just a few leaves, you can just leave those on the ground to decompose on their own and be adding to the soil organic matter as that lawn grows up. Whether to weed or not in your lawn, if there's a burdock growing in your lawn, I'd probably pull that out unless I was really needing that burdock medicine and I wanted to grow it for that purpose. But burdock can get 6 foot tall and 6 foot deep and full of burrs. So how are you using that space? The answer to the question of how you're using that space will determine, should I leave those plants or not? Could you just repeat that question one more time? I just want to make sure I answered all parts of it.
As I say hello to my garden, I'm not sure what to leave alone and what to rake and clean up. I'm used to raking grass so it grows better, and also is matted and is not matted down and thatchy, encouraging grubs to eat it, and then moles to wreck my lawn by burrowing to get at the grubs. For best soil health, should I not disturb the thatch? Are grubs really my friends?
So I would give some mild disturbance to your thatch, because I think that is helpful. And something that might be helpful to everyone is to do a little experiment in your lawn. Take an area of your lawn and don't dethatch it at all and see what happens. Does it grow faster or slower than the rest? You might be surprised. You might find that a lot of that busy work you do in the spring isn't actually all that helpful, or you might find the opposite. So a lot depends on where your site is. As far as the grubs go, if I don't know exactly what kind of grub it is, I leave it, because a lot of animals, a lot of bugs do that in their life cycle phase, and I don't want to be throwing out the beneficial ones. However, I've gotten pretty good at identifying Japanese beetle grubs. And I've been known to squish them. I've been known to feed them to chickens. I've been known to leave them. It just depends. If I'm scratching underneath rose bushes, I'm at least gonna fling them. Because Japanese beetles are gonna decimate the roses. However, if you have super good soil biology and you have water infiltration, you have that soil sponge underneath your rose bushes that are providing for all the nutrient cycling and the billions of organisms to not just be in the ground, but coat the surface, every leaf surface of that rose. Japanese beetles are going to think those roses taste crappy. So it's really a lot about soil health. And in terms of the grub, that's a really hard question. I think I made it clear that it's like I make a decision in the moment about the grubs.
Right, I have so many different beds and sections of my garden that have gotten amended with different things and are growing different things. How to test each of them in a way that's helpful. And is soil testing important?
Okay, I'm going to start with the last question first. Is soil testing important? It depends what you're trying to do. If what you're trying to see is how your management of the land is changing the content of your soil physically, chemically, or biologically, then soil testing can be a really good tool to help tell that story for you. If you're also keeping track of your management style and what you're growing where. I do use soil tests, not all the time. I'm generally looking for the story of change over time when I look at a soil test and not for diagnostics. There are some 600 different ways to test soil, depending on what lab you're using, what chemical compounds are being used. And what's most important is that whatever lab you choose, you keep the same one. Because the tests are done differently at each lab, if you get a test from Cornell and next time you get one from UVM and next time you get one from AgriLab, you're not really even going to be able to tell the story over the years because each lab is looking at different things and getting at those answers in different ways. So yes, soil testing can be important. Most soil labs are only looking at the physical and chemical properties of soil without the biological component really even considered. So the physical properties are like, is it sand, silt, or clay? Are there a lot of rocks? Is it compacted? Are there soil aggregates? The chemical part is what's the pH? What's the nutrient cycling like? Is there too much phosphorus? Are things out of balance? The biological part is how many organisms per gram of soil are alive in my soil. So most soil testing companies, if they're going to tell you about biology at all, are going to do a soil respiration test, which is basically like, is there anybody breathing in there? And they'll be able to tell you, yeah, you've got some life in there, but they won't tell you what kind. You can spend a lot of money and send your soil off to Earth Fort Lab in Oregon or Woods End Lab in Maine, and they can tell you who's living in your soil, approximately what kinds of bacteria and at what ratio to fungus, and what kinds of fungus, and are they the good mycorrhizal or are they the bad, disease-causing fungus? No matter what you do, that soil test is one single snapshot in one moment of time in the places you happen to collect from. So if you're interested in learning about the storyline of your soil, go ahead, get your soil test. These days, you're going to want to call the lab first because things have changed from COVID, because it's a really busy time of year for them, and they're not processing soil tests as quickly as usual, but they are still processing at UVM. And the lab that I typically use is UVM Soil Lab because I think it's important for us to help our state extension service learn as much about our native soils as possible and the way that we manage our land. So I think it's helpful to everyone with the collective knowledge to use UVM Lab. But if I'm looking for something specific for a client, I might go to Earthfort or Woods End or Cornell, which has a wonderful, really, really incredible soil testing service there. The first part of the question again, Jael?
I have
Amendments.
so many different sections.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
different
So
things, how to test each of them in different
for most
ways.
gardens, we don't find that there's so much different in little plots that we would send in each plot differently. If you do, it's $14 for each plot. Typically, when we go into a farm field or a garden, we're going to take, you know, let's say it's 100 by 50 foot garden. I would go into that garden and I would take samples, properly collected samples from about 16 places in that garden, and I would mix them all together in a bucket, and then I would take a sample of that and I would send it to the lab. Because most of the time, that's what they're going to be. They're not going to say, oh, you have exactly this much calcium and you have to add this much nitrogen. What are you growing matters. And oftentimes, it's the biology that's missing in the soil. You know, nobody's feeding the forest 10-10-10 fertilizer or just enough potassium or just enough phosphorus. But yet the forest gets what it needs from the biological organisms under the ground that are turning sand, silt, and clay into the micronutrients that plants need. So these organisms produce organic acids that actually break down rock. This all happens in the rhizosphere, and it works with the sugars and the biology and the plants, and everybody gets what they need. So the cheapest way out is going to take 16 samples and send in one. If you really want to know the difference between each site, you can send in 16 different tests, and in the end, you're probably going to find that there's a very, very minor, if any, difference between all of those plots. I hope that was sufficient.
All right, let's see if I can group some of these together. What about things like how to deal with bishop weed? Should I not pull up weeds now, just make a tea or salad out of them? And I heard someone say that the type of weeds growing tell you something about your soil. How can we find out what they're saying? Yep, that's it. I think enough for now.
Okay, so weeds. So yes, different plants will tell us a lot about what's happening under the soil and what's happening all around our landscape. We can ask ourselves, how does nature grow food? We can ask ourselves, how does nature plant food? How does nature move seeds around? Why are these plants here? Can I eat this food? Is this food medicine? You know, is this weed medicine? Those are all important questions to ask before we decide something is a weed. Should I pull weeds now? In Vermont right now, we all know, I'm sorry to say, but we all know we could get another foot of snow. So I wouldn't pull weeds yet. I would let those weeds grow and photosynthesize and feed that soil. But if I were going to hoe a row of peas, I might take the weeds out of that row. But having a dandelion grow 12 inches away from my sprouting pea plant is only going to help that pea. It's not going to hurt it. So I would use some discretion there. As you plant your crops, decide what needs to go and who can stay as you plant those crops. Bishop weed, I feel like I might have missed something from that part of the question, Jazz, so feel free to correct me after
Just asking about invasives and how to deal with them. And then there's also like, how do you prevent the weeds from competing with the veggie roots, the cover crop and the
Right, okay, so
weed roots?
Unless you're a market farmer, I would I would relax a little bit about the competition. Market farmers, you know, they've got to actually market stuff to people like us who are scrutinizing their work, right? So they've got to make sure to get the biggest stuff. When we could be better buyers and not be so demanding of them. And in our own gardens, we could probably let go a little bit about the need for really large vegetables. The competition it's a lot a misnomer. Yes, there's some truth. If you have 6 plants growing in 1 teaspoon, not all of them are going to survive. Or if you have 6 plants growing in 1 square foot, some are going to do better than other, and maybe they'll all suffer a little bit. So when I'm growing my tomatoes in that polyculture that you saw in my slideshow, that ground was just covered in plants. And I got more tomatoes than I've ever had. It was a great tomato year. I also had bees buzzing around my tomatoes all season long. My cherry tomatoes, every time another flower came out, like the bees were fighting over who was going to pollinate it. And I had lots of tomatoes. So the weeds were not competing for the sunlight because I kept cutting their heads off and just letting their feet stay in the ground. I left enough leaves so that photosynthesis was happening, and all the microbes in the soil were, I'd like to project on them that they were super happy. I don't know that, but they were getting lots of food, and my tomatoes were happy and healthy, and I had like no diseases. It was amazing. And I had more bugs in my garden than I've ever had, good bugs. I didn't have any hornworms that year. That could have just been like I found them early. I'm not claiming that, you know, you won't have hornworms. I might have just found them early. But I also had a lot of diversity in my garden. I had tachnid flies and I had parasitic wasps, and they lay eggs in tomato hornworms. And then they become paralyzed and they can't eat the tomato plant, and then they become the host for more beneficial insects. So when you think about whether or not plants are competing for nutrients, that's only one of the functions that we should be worried about. Are those plants working together to bring in masses of beneficial organisms? And is that more important than some competition that we perceive? When we walk into the forest and we see stacks of plants on top of each other, they don't seem to be fighting. Or when we walk into a diversified pasture with 45 different species growing in it, everybody seems to be getting along pretty well. So if we're trying to grow burdock and carrots in the same place, we got to rethink that. But if we're trying to grow tomatoes and carrots in the same place, you can do that. You're trying to grow a nice low growing cover like legumes or like a white clover underneath tomatoes, that's great. But if you're going to try and grow a legume cover crop underneath your bean crop, probably not such a great idea. They're both competing for the same nutrients because they're both legumes. But buckwheat under your bean crop could be a good idea. So I hope that that made some sense. And I do want to just talk about goutweed, bishopweed, because I know. I have it too. And I've tried everything, and I've actually had some success. If you want to painstakingly manage it, you can actually manage bishopweed pretty well by cutting a trench around. You find the very last root of goutweed or bishopweed. It splits, it's got 2 heads, and then it's got roots from both sides. You have to find both of those, go all the way to the end, and cut a trench 3 foot out from there all the way around the garden, and then build a hill on top. Yeah, and then plant hostas. Take that. Never came back. Never came back. So I should do a little plug for Mike Bald, who runs an organization called Got Weeds, and he is like the guy that knows more about invasive species than anyone else I know in this state. And his take is that he understands these plants are here for a reason. And if we want to try and have some influence over them, we have to work with them, not against them. So just take that to heart with some of those invasive plants.
All right. How do I keep water in my landscape?
Okay. By building a soil carbon sponge. And the way we build the soil carbon sponge is we follow those soil health principles, living roots in the ground for as long as possible with green growing plants on top. Those are our conductors of photosynthesis, which is causing all of our carbon cycling and our nutrient cycling and our water cycling. In order for water to stick around in soil, it needs pore space, it needs living plants, and it needs soil organic matter. And so what we can do is create the conditions for a soil carbon sponge. What I'd like you to think about in terms of building soil is that we build soil on top. Anybody who's on the call that's been gardening for 20 years or more, you've probably seen the ground level of your garden actually get taller. It's grown. We build soil. When we drive through the fields of Ireland and England and all those hedged rows and all along the roads, we can see that the soil has built and built and built itself. So if we could think more about building up soil rather than digging into soil, that would help us to get to that sponge. If we build the soil up and we're adding the organic matter and we're adding the green growing plants, all of the organisms and whole systems that support all of life on Earth will bring that soil sponge deeper into the ground without our help.
Okay. Okay, pest management. Is it not a good thing to let bunnies run all around my yard? Should I not cover up all my shrubberies so bunnies don't eat them all? And then the next one is, what is the best method to avoid flea beetles or at least control them?
Okay, bunnies and then flea beetles. Bunnies are darn cute, and their poop is great, but boy, can they eat a lot. So I wouldn't let them run around your carrot patch or your lettuce patch. But why not have them, you know, if you have bunnies as pets or if you have wild bunnies around, what can you do to encourage them to come into your berry patch, which is their natural habitat? So they're helping, you know, they're pooping, they're not eating your plants, they're living there. So finding the right place for bunnies to be, I think, is important. And if you're trying to grow lettuce or carrots or radishes or all the other things that all the bunnies like, then I highly recommend a good cage that might need to go deep under the ground so that they don't actually burrow underneath it. Or raised beds. Raised beds can be good for that sort of thing too. You can actually grow a lot on your porch and patio and windowsill too if you have a deep enough bucket. So I know some people live in places where there's like severe deer pressure. Can be so frustrating. You basically have to build a jail and grow your food in it. Oh, and flea beetles. Okay. Flea beetles are really challenging. So some things to know about flea beetles: they like to lay their eggs in bare soil. So if you till your garden, you have flea beetles. When I stopped tilling my garden, no flea beetles. So there's a big plus to no till or minimize till or having green manure or polycultures, or, you know, getting to know which plants are going to stay low, grow well together, play well, party well, and not outcompete each other or take over my other plants, and be able to stand up to getting walked on and get their heads constantly cut off. There's an amazing number of plants that are okay with all that. That's what's really cool. So try to minimize the amount of bare soil in your garden. They absolutely love brassicas, and pretty much all nightshades. So brassicas are your broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, mustards, kale, all of those guys. And your nightshades are your peppers and tomatoes and eggplants. And there's some other plants too, but those are the three they really, really like. And I've seen them decimate entire fields of seedlings. So, but if you think about it, what we've done is we've said, okay, we know that you like bare soil and we know that you like brassicas. And right now there's nothing else growing. It's early, May when we put our brassicas out. So we're going to put out brassicas in bare soil and then get mad when flea beetles come. It's kind of like putting cheese on the counter for the mouse and saying, don't you touch that. So how can we change those conditions so that we're not inviting the pest that we're trying to not attract? So one way you can do that is with living mulches. Another way you can do that is milk jugs around have you seen this? You cut the bottom of the milk jug off and you put it over your brassica. That can actually help a lot until the brassica gets so big it's trying to get out of the milk jug. Remake cloth, which is that white floating row cover you see on lots of farms. Very useful, reusable fabric. But if you are going to put row covers, let's say that last year you planted Brussels sprouts, had a bad flea beetle problem, and this year you planted mustard greens in that same spot, and you're trying to keep the flea beetles out. If you put remake cloth over top of that spot, you've just trapped the flea beetles in the row cover because they laid their eggs in the soil last year on the Brussels sprouts. So think about, this is one reason that crop rotation can be really helpful tool in managing flea beetles. So I guess I'll leave it at that with also think about how do you manage them and not how do you get rid of them, because that's not going to happen as long as you have bare soil and are growing brassicas.
Right, tomato blight. Is this like coronavirus of my garden? Does it linger and also affect winter squash?
So as far as I know, tomato blight does not affect winter squash. That's a different thing. Both winter squashes, actually all squashes and all tomatoes have so many amazing diseases, most of which are soil borne, but not all of them. Like the downy mildew and the powdery mildew that we see on our winter squash in the fall, that typically comes in air. There might be some soil companion to it as well. Again, if your biology in your soil is plentiful, meaning lots of organisms and lots of different kinds of organisms, meaning diverse, so everything from bacteria to fungus, those diseases can't take hold. There's no room for them. That same biological diversity that is in your soil is also potentially in different species on every leaf surface of every plant. And if the plant surface is already populated, there's no room for pests to land. So really working on getting your biology right through diversity, and you don't have to be a chemist. We don't even know the names of all these organisms yet, so don't think like, oh, I got this one, I got this one. It's not about a checklist. It's about creating the conditions to maximize diversity using the soil health principles and maximizing opportunities for photosynthesis, water infiltration, and airflow.
So then the next section, a lot about how to establish a garden when you have a lawn, what the best method is, if you should, pull up the lawn, till it in, or plant on top of it. If it's really compacted, how do you deal with that? What's the best way to establish a garden with a lawn when you only have a lawn?
Okay, so I'll do my best here. There is a little lawn handout that's available on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website. We're in the process of updating that, so there will be a better one soon. And that was something I worked on with Mark McKenzie. I think I saw that he's on this call. He's like a lawn expert, soil health guy. I also was just sent a really good video. I can't remember her name, but it was sent to me by Lynn Wild, who's also on this call. Lynn, if you're there and you can put that in the chat, that'd be great. This was a video, short YouTube video of a woman who just had a brilliant way of teaching. And she was using no-till techniques in her garden, and she used some tips for how you might manage your lawn. So I'll kind of go through that, and also based on my own experience. And I've tried all sorts of things. I've tried everything from, and you can do this if you have really poor soil, like say at a school. I've planted lots of food at schools. Schools typically have awful soil. You know, it's just, there's no nutrients, there's no topsoil. So some of the things we've done at schools is we would run a tiller through the ground for about 6 inches, just shallow till to get some air in there, break up the lawn. And then we put down cardboard. And then we put down about a foot of mixed compost and soil. And I usually do like a 2/3 soil, 1/3 compost mix. And then I planted peas and oats in it. And then I mowed it and dropped it, and mowed it and dropped it, and mowed it and dropped it. And the following spring, I turned it into a raspberry patch. It was awesome. And now that's been our raspberry patch for, I think, going on 8 years at Thetford Elementary School. Really not a problem with weeds. The raspberries are great. Did a similar thing for blueberry patch, and we call it Blueberry Hill. We went about 3 feet higher with that soil. And it's a little hill with 9 blueberry bushes on it in a schoolyard. If you think that your soil might not be that bad, it's just compacted, and not that bad means you think there's some life in it and it wasn't built on like a dump or just plain old building materials. Then you can take a spade fork, which looks like a pitchfork, but it's much sturdier. It's a gardening tool and not a hay tool. If you take that and you shove it into the ground, and assuming you can get the fork in the ground, you just stick that fork in and wiggle it. You're not going to flip the soil over. You're just aerating the soil. You can do that, and hopefully you can get as deep as the spade fork. Sometimes soil is so compact under a lawn, you just can't even get anything in there. You can do shallow holes, like I mentioned before with that barrel with spikes on it. You can make your own. You can strap boards to your feet with nails poked through, obviously down, not into your feet, and walk around your lawn and poke holes in your lawn that way. So you're trying, how do you get air in the lawn? That's the first thing you want to do, is aerate that lawn. A tiller would be my last option, but it's not off the table. It just depends on what else is going on that site. Then I would not remove the grass. I would leave it, because that is future food for biology. So then I would work on building the soil on top of that newly loosened ground that I'm no longer going to step on because I just loosened it. And I would layer on a variety of materials like compost, ideally finished compost, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be. I would use different kinds of manure, whatever I had access to. Leaves of different kinds that are at various stages of broken down, like the bottom of the leaf pile kind of leaves. I would throw in some straw, and I would get it nice and big, and then I would cover the top of that with my cardboard, and then I'd poke holes where I want all my plants to go, and I'd plant them. Before I put the cardboard down, I would water everything really well. That's important. And then you put the cardboard down, and that's your mulch to block photosynthesis from anywhere except the plants you want growing. You can do that right on top of your lawn.
Part of along this whole same train of thought, how about like if you're trying to establish a large corn field for a commodity crop, not too large but fairly big, could you use the same method?
Well, I would say that must be true, because before tractors, people grew corn. Lots of it. In fact, our indigenous brothers and sisters in this valley who still live here know how to do this. This is the way that corn has always been grown. So yes, you can. But if you're expecting yields like the Corn Growers Association tells you should get per bushel, that's not going to happen. But if you can measure your yield in biological soil health and water infiltration and pollinators and diverse ecosystem above the ground, and you can start thinking about the ecosystem services that we all rely on for life as part of that yield, your yield will be great. So if you're trying to grow something and start out as a commercial farmer or do something for market commodity style, it's hard to make that decision without understanding the economic constraints that you're put in to do that. So that's a different conversation because your well-being and your livelihood also matters. So you might need to till in order to get that done. But if you're looking to build a crop, a place that can grow commodity corn, and you're going to start in 3 years, that will change the trajectory of how you need to manage that land to get it ready. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific about that, but again, I would invite bigger questions like that. You know, please feel free to send an email, and if I can't answer it, I'll include other people in the response who can.
So we were scheduled to go to 9, and I just want to do kind of a temperature check with everyone that's still on the call. If you all want to go to participants and click that icon so you can see everyone. And then there's some buttons underneath everyone's name, and you hit the button that says more and hit your thumb. Click on your thumb up if you're doing okay and you want to keep going with more of Kat's answers. All right, it looks like people are still up for more information, Kat. So
okay, all right, I'm not tired yet.
Not tired yet. Great. Right, so I'm going to go back up to the top of the list. Are there any special methods to retain nutrients in the soil when your garden is on a sloping hillside?
Good question. Living roots is the best thing to retain nutrients in the soil. Diverse living roots, thinking back to that slide with the nice deep root systems, try and put some plants in like that. Lupin are really nice. Legume, they have a nice deep taproot. Dandelion, nice deep taproot. Comfrey, excellent at holding hillsides back. In fact, you can go around to Vermont farms and you'll notice places where there's like a wall of comfrey with soil, like it's a wall because somebody planted it in the 70s and it's just built soil around it ever since. And once you plant comfrey, you'll pretty much always have it there, which is another thing the folks in the 70s figured out when they tried to move it. It didn't move, or they moved it and it grew back in both places. And I love comfrey. I think it's an amazing plant, great medicine, incredible in the orchard, really wonderful ecosystem service provider and nutrient cycler. So on hillsides, be thinking of plants that have lots of root mass. If you're thinking about cover crops, things like grasses, like the oats or barley. Again, remember whether or not you want a perennial or annual is going to matter depending on what you're going to do with that spot. Growing grasses on a slope and then expecting to mow them, probably not a great idea. But if you're going to scythe it, that could totally work. If you're just going to plant annuals because you want to put a lot of root mass in the ground, let's say it's a new building site and you've got all this bare, really bad soil all around your house, and you want to try and retain that in place so that it doesn't wash down the road the next huge rainstorm we have, you can try and plant a mixed species cover crop, maybe some clover and peas and oats and buckwheat all together, And that's going to get you some biomass of roots in the ground to hold that soil in place, and biomass above the ground to help break the impact of those raindrops so they don't splash your soil away. Other really interesting things to think about are terracing. And if we look to some of the Asian cultures in the world, there are incredible techniques for terracing that are ancient, old. They do them on the steepest hillsides, and they're planting fruit trees and asparagus and all these amazing plants, understanding on contour. So when we think about planting on contour, if we have a steep slope, we're not going to plant a trench down the slope. We're going to plant along the slope to try and think about a raindrop coming down the hill and how can we catch that and hold it in place. And some people use a tool in a term called key line plowing when they are plowing on hillsides, so that you can dig a trench to get your plant in, which will then retain the whole hillside. So yeah, I recommend checking that out. I wish I was a little more adept, because I do actually have all these cool slides, but I like looking at you all. So I'm just not going to show you the other slides. But I have one on terraces. That's really cool.
We'll share out those slides.
Oh yeah, it'll be a part of the, yeah.
See it. So I have cover cropping in my veg garden to give it a rest this year. After I mow in the fall, how do I plant my veggies next year? Leave cover crop and furrow, or till under? And then, do you want another one, Kat, or just one at a time?
Yeah, let me do that one. Okay, so it's going to depend on the kind of cover crop. If you can manage, I think it's great. You're going to take a year off and do cover cropping. You'll probably do a couple of different crops. So if it were me and I had a bed with the luxury of taking a whole year off, I would think about pretty soon here getting out there and planting some peas and oats. Soil temps are not quite 50 degrees yet. So again, I would wait. It's been such an early spring. It tricks us every time. But just remember, we could still get a foot of snow, and seeds are scarce. So be thinking about that before you go out and plant. If you were planting an annual series of cover crops, you could start out with peas and oats, and then maybe sprinkle in some buckwheat as the soil warms a little bit more. Throw in some mustards in there when the peas and oats are about knee high, into all those bare spots you can see between the blades of grass and the pea shoots coming up. You can scratch them in a little with your fingers if you want to. You don't have to. If you don't, you know, the birds will come by and eat some of them too, and that's okay. We always give a little extra for the birds. And then when your cover crop gets to be about knee high or a little higher, you would come in and just scythe it. Cut and drop. Let it drop right in spot. If you let that cover crop go to flower, some of the nutrients that cover crop is providing in your soil are now getting tied up in the plant through the flowering process. So ideally, you want to scythe those down and let them drop to the ground before they flower. You can continue to sow other crops into it, or you could say, you know what, those oats were really tight together. I'm just going to go ahead and turn them. I'm going to put the feet up in the air, and then I'm going to sow another crop on top of that for the summer. And that one is going to be a winter kill crop. So I'm going to let it get nice and tall. I might cut it a couple times. If we have a really late fall, I might cut it and drop it. And then when the winter comes, all of those plants are going to die because they're annual. And then in the spring, you're going to have beautiful friable soil underneath a thin layer of decaying browned plant matter. And that's a beautiful scenario. If you do that with rye, going to be a very different story if it's perennial rye. So I would try for as much diversity as you can in that cover crop. And you know, as we get into these times where we're all trying to learn to garden like nature does, using the tools that we have, I can't recommend enough that you keep a bit of a garden journal so that you write down what you did. Because after 20 years, you can't remember which year you did what. So that way you can share your expertise with other people and tell them what actually worked and didn't work. It's just as important to share what didn't work. All right, I think I'm ready for another one.
I'm muted. I'm going to just do one more with cover crops because it kind of also asked about nitrogen. I'm trying to crop a field piece this spring in beds where I'll plant tomatoes and potatoes in June. I'm not sure how to finish off the pea vines. Can I just crimp them to kill them? I'm also confused by the nitrogen cycle when it comes to using legumes as cover crops. If the vines are just sitting as a mat above the soil, how does the N get incorporated into the soil? Seems like it's just going to be released into the atmosphere. How does that work? And then someone also asked about how the nitrogen is fixed with nearby plants.
Okay. Okay, so nitrogen is a cycle. It's always moving. We can't stop it. We shouldn't. All we can do is try and be a part of that cycle. I mean, whether we try or not, we are a part of that cycle. But when we're gardening, trying to make sure that the natural nitrogen cycle is functioning means that we are trying to make sure that there are enough leguminous plants in the mix. And all leguminous plants will fix nitrogen. They do this by partnering with rhizomaceous bacteria. So before we talked about the rhizosphere, that's that little place, microscopic place around every root hair. This particular kind of bacteria is rhizomaceous bacteria. So it's bacteria that specifically likes to live in the rhizosphere. And this particular kind actually likes to live in the rhizosphere of leguminous plants. And when you have the right partnership among these rhizobium bacteria, they are able to fix nitrogen out of the air, and they hold it in little balls on their plant roots. That was that slide I showed earlier, and it will be in the slideshow again. And I highly recommend, like, now that you know this, every time you go see a clover plant, like, dig it up and look at the balls on the roots. You're going to be so blown away. And if you don't see those balls, you don't have the bacteria in your soil, or you have too much compaction, or the conditions are just not correct. There are inoculants. You may have seen them before and might not have even known what they were, but sometimes if you order pea or bean seeds or certain legume seeds from seed companies, they will come with an inoculum. And you're supposed to take your bean seeds and soak them in some water with this inoculum overnight before you plant them. That is the little rhizobium bacteria. So you're getting that into your soil. It lives here naturally. If we manage landscapes in a way that were more conducive to whole system ecosystem function, they would probably be here, but you can add them. So when you trap nitrogen into a plant, I'm just going to use that word even though it's really the wrong word, you're cycling nitrogen into a plant, and then that plant dies. Some of that nitrogen is going to turn back into a gas. That's how it happens. We don't want to stop that. We need that cycle. Some of that nitrogen is going to break down in the soil off those living root systems or off those decaying root systems. The nitrogen that's taken in by those organisms, held inside those little nitrogen nodules on the leguminous plants, actually make nitrogen available to other plants in the area. So in crop rotation, even in big, traditional, conventional farms, a common crop rotation is to follow beans with corn, because soybeans, in commercial commodity crops, fix nitrogen. And even though they're, doing all the things they might be doing to the soil and mechanized farming and all of that, there's still some nitrogen left in the soil, and then you would grow corn afterwards, which is a very heavy nitrogen feeder. So that's partly why some of these crop rotations were designed, because of the functionality of plants. Which nutrients do they use? Which ones do they leave behind? What residues do they leave? What pests do they bring in? what diseases do they leave behind or are they susceptible to, and we manage our crops accordingly so that we don't repeat the same crop in bad farming systems. If we have a bean blight and we keep growing beans in the same spot, no matter how much nitrogen we're fixing, those plants are going to be sick. And just like us, when we are sick, when we're systemically ill, we can't actually assimilate all of the nutrients we take in. They pass right through us. So plants are essentially the same. So I hope that was a helpful explanation of the nitrogen cycle and why we can't stop it, and why, yes, it's important to fix nitrogen, and yes, it does become available to other plants. And snip your pea at the base and let it fall to the ground. Just let it die right there, unless you're hurting for materials for your compost pile. But you know, if you take your garden debris away, then you got to bring something else in to cover it. So depends how hard you want to work. Jael, you're muted.
Thank you. Trying to mute my dog. How important, so there's 3 little composting questions I'm gonna throw at you. You've kind of covered some of this already, but how important is it to get organic manure with regard to herbicides being persistent and impacting the garden negatively? And then how old must chicken manure be before using it in the garden? And then do you add amendments to your compost piles like kitty litter, rock phosphate, and at what rates?
Okay. So first, herbicides and horse manure. So I'll just give a little backstory there so that folks can understand the base of that question. Some years ago in Vermont, it might be 10 years ago now, there was an incident with a compost company that was getting manure from a horse farm where the horses were eating feed that was grown with persistent herbicides. The manure had signs of this persistent herbicide, and when it went through the composting process, it still had. So this herbicide, an herbicide kills green growing plants, not insects. It's just a plant killer. This particular herbicide, it's in the pyrrolid class of herbicides, was able to persist through the gut of a horse, through a high heat composting process, and then through the process of turning that into a potting soil. And the reason we found out about this is because a farmer had bought the potting soil and all of his seedlings died because there was an herbicide in the soil. And of course, plants can't grow when there's herbicide in the soil. So this raised what is a continuing investigation generally that we all need to be doing is what things persist through composting. We don't test for that. There are so many persistent chemicals in the world, BPAs, I could go on and on and on, aerosols, all sorts of things that we don't test to see, are they there at the finished compost? We would actually have to test for each one individually, and who's going to pay for that? So I'd like it if someone said, I'll pay for that. But so far that hasn't happened. So it is important to know where your compost is coming from. And in terms of horse manure, it is an important question if you're going to be growing vegetables, to make sure that the horses that you're getting the poop from were not fed feed with this pyrrolid class of herbicides. And there may be other classes as well. As I said, we don't really know. This is just one that happened to pop up. You can still compost that material, and I think we'd all like to believe that over time it would become inert, but we don't know that either. We don't know that either. So that was the herbicide question. The aged chicken manure, how long? It depends what you're growing. If you're trying to grow something from seed, you want it well aged, like totally composted, because the heat and the high nitrogen content of chicken manure, which is pretty high, will burn your seeds, and they won't grow. It can also sometimes burn plant material if it gets too close. Aging chicken manure it's actually really easy to compost. Chicken manure is excellent in the compost because it's so high heat, high nitrogen. You can throw it into any compost pile and it's going to heat it up right into the center, as long as you're following all the other instructions for composting, which I teach whole classes on, so I can't really get into that, but you can find some of my handouts up on my website. They're all free up there. And I think they're also on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website. So how aged matters only depending on what you're growing. If you're going to plant a fruit tree, or if you're going to fertilize a 2 or 3 year old fruit tree, you know, if your chicken pooped right under the tree, the tree would be happy about it. So, you know, it could be fresh. So it's also about what do you want to handle, what's sanitary, and how can you best use that material. It would probably be better heating up a compost pile than it would be dumped in your garden where it's going to burn seeds. So I hope that was helpful. The next question was about amendments for composting. So things like rock dust or kitty litter, and I assume by kitty litter you mean like the natural kinds of kitty litter, because no, you shouldn't put stinky chemical kitty litter in any part of your garden. And just by the way, I use sawdust for kitty litter and that works out pretty darn well. But I don't put that in my kitchen compost. I have a special compost for kitty litter because I use sawdust and it's so high carbon. I have a special pile where I manage all of the cat litter, which is sawdust, and weeds and lawn clippings for when we do mow the lawn. I throw my weeds in there too, and that's the nitrogen. And that finished product goes to replace growth in the lawn, like where we drive our cars and stuff. So I don't recommend, I think the question was more about amendments, and I'll get there, but I do want to say I don't generally recommend composting pet waste unless you're going to do it separately, and just keep it away from your garden, because cats and dogs have some parasites and diseases that are transferable to humans. And if you're not making sure that you're getting pathogen kill everywhere, that can be the problem. That can be a problem. The same is true for human manure compost, which is just composting human poop, which I also do. But I'm also careful, and I have rules about the way that that happens. As far as other amendments like wood ash, I often get asked, should I add wood ash to my compost? Should I add rock dust to my compost? And the answer is no. Add it to your garden if you want to add it to your garden. Microbes don't care about rocks unless they're getting it in a rhizosphere area where they're getting sugars from photosynthesis. Like, microbes in a compost pile just want to eat and reproduce. They don't eat rock and they don't eat ash. The ashes from a wood fire are the mineral content that is left after fire ate the organic matter. Microbes like organic matter. So adding ashes into your compost pile will not feed the microbes. It will only cool your compost down. Adding those amendments to your compost before you spread it into your field might be a good way if you're trying to spread those amendments into your field. But no, compost does not need any kind of bought amendments or rock or ash kind of amendments.
All right, well, we've actually
Whoa, it's 2 minutes to 9.
time limit. And there's still so many questions to get through.
Can I answer one more? I saw
almost
that
feel
was
like,
really intriguing.
yeah.
Somebody asked, what do I plant under my fruit trees? I love that question. And there are so many great things to plant under your fruit trees. Low growing flowers that flower before, during, and after the fruit tree flowers, so that you're attracting insects, keeping them around, so that you're providing habitat and not just attracting pollinators. Pollinators are great, but we also need insects to be there all the time. So flowering plants, yarrow is a great one. I would give you the tip to look up on Google, the Oracle, look up permaculture and look up permaculture principles. And you will find something called guilds, plant guilds. It's just like a human guild where a group of artists or a group of like minds work together on a given problem or project. Plants also can work together, like those polycultures I showed you in my slides. Those are plant guilds. They're guilds of plants that are working together well. And there are different functions to guilds. So for example, there are dynamic accumulator plants. These are plants that have deep taproots, like a dandelion or lupin or comfrey. Those plants are breaking up compaction. They're bringing nutrients and minerals from the subsoil up to other plants. They're tapping into excess water during times of drought. There are plants that are attractors. So that might be like yarrow or Johnny jump ups even, or dianthus, things, lovely little flowers on them that are attracting all kinds of beneficial insects. There are detractors like alliums or daffodils, or things that mice don't like, or certain insects or deer don't like. Those are detractor plants. There are also mulching plants, so plants that naturally have very large leaves like comfrey or burdock, that when their leaves spread out all over the ground, nothing else grows there. That's their natural superpower. They make no other plants want to grow near them. So thinking about plants in terms of some of the functions that they serve in ecosystems is a great way to think about which plants you would put underneath your fruit trees. So just to say that again, check out permaculture, check out the permaculture design principles, and look up fruit tree guilds.
So one thing that we wanted to talk about that we never got to was how, I think we might need to do another webinar on this topic, but during this time, the COVID crisis, how we can support each other and how we can use regenerative gardening to do that. And we wanted to try and connect people with each other so that they could maybe collaborate on gardening projects, or you know, one group of people could, or one family could grow all the legumes, and another family could grow the tomatoes, and a third family could grow the lettuces. So, and then they could all share or something. So if you want to be a part of a network in working together and growing food together in your community, send me an email. I'll send out another sign-up sheet because we like to connect people if we can, if you're interested in that. And then we also, let me know if you're interested in participating in another gardening webinar. Part of our Put Carbon in the Ground campaign is we're hopefully gonna do several workshops throughout the summer, and in person if possible, but we will, if not, we will offer some more webinars on this topic. And we're always grateful for your support of 350 Vermont and our work, and also in supporting the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. So thank you everyone for joining. And I will send out a document with the recorded webinar and the resource document with the questions and books and all the other things that we have for everyone to look through. And then feel free to, I'm an organic vegetable grower, so I can answer a lot of questions too. But feel free to reach out to me or Kat if you have any more questions about this topic. And
And
thank
can I give
you
a shout
again
out?
for, yes.
Can I give a shout out to two webinars happening next week? Wednesday night, Radical Forestry, and Thursday night is storytelling from fossil fuel resistance campaigns. So you'll get information about 350 Vermont upcoming events, but next week is the 50th anniversary of Earth Week, so we've got Earth Day. So we've got a bunch of actions and webinars that you can do in your community, in your house, from your computer, and in your yard.
Yeah, so Earth Week next week, a lot of celebrations, a lot of events happening. And yeah, please join us. And the webinar next week on the vertical forester, we'll talk about how to manage your forest, or if you have some forest on your property, to help it sequester more carbon and combat climate change. So thank you, everyone. So a long, fun, fruitful evening.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. That was great. Let's do it again. And happy
Yes.
gardening. Don't be shy. Take some risks. Write it down. Feed each other.
Thanks, Kat. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jael and Sonia. You guys are great.
We'll follow up. Take care, everyone. I can't end the meeting, Kat.
Okay, I'm ending it. Thanks, you guys. That was so
Thank you.
fun.
Thanks, Kat. That was great.
Let's do it again.
Yeah.
Bye.